Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for attending this really exciting, interesting, timely seminar. Welcome on behalf of King's College London, and I would like to simply start off by thanking the Department of Political Economy and the King's Brazil Institute for their support for this event, but most of all, its organizer, Daniel Alves, who's one of our brilliant PhD students, whose personal initiative this seminar represents, and who has worked incredibly hard to make sure that we can all enjoy a really stimulating 90 minutes or so of discussion about the politics and political economy of Brazil. So I'm very pleased to hand over to Professor Anthony Pereira, who's our chair for this evening, and will introduce all the speakers. But thank you for coming and welcome.
Thank you, Nicola. Really appreciate those warm words of welcome, and we'll come back to you as a commentator after the panel. And I think if we had been in this moment 36 years ago, we would have been in the middle of a transition that now looks very certain to us, but didn't actually look that certain then. We should remind ourselves, there had been an indirect election in Congress that Tancredo Neves won in January of 1985, but he hadn't taken office yet. And one of the things Tancredo used to say is, it's not just about winning the election. You have to win the posse, or you have to win the inauguration as well. You have to actually get to the inauguration. And it wasn't at all clear in 1985, at this time of the year in 1985, that Brazil was really going to complete its transition. And of course, it was a lot more complicated than we would have thought in early February 1985, because Tancredo got very ill and ended up dying before he could be inaugurated. And so the job went to his vice presidential running mate. There was a constitutional debate about whether he should assume office, could assume office. He did in the end. But I think that's an interesting reminder of how fragile these processes can be. And so I want to thank Daniel for doing all the hard work for putting this together, but I think it's an interesting moment to reflect on the military regime, democracy, and issues associated with it. We have a very good panel. Our first speaker will be Francisco Ferreira, who's the Amartya Sen Professor of Inequality Studies and Director of the International Inequalities Institute, the London School of Economics. We have then Joana Silva, Associate Professor at the Católica Lisboa since 2019, and she's an expert in applied microeconomics with a focus on development, labor markets, and international trade, firm dynamics, and policy evaluation. And our third speaker will be Matias Spektor, who's Associate Professor and founder of the School of International Relations at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo. And his area of expertise is international security and foreign policy. And I should say that Matias was the first holder of the Rio Branco chair at the Brazil Institute at King's several years ago. And we were very, very happy to have Matias with us for what turned out to be a year and a half. And you're the first and also the longest serving holder of the Rio Branco chair. And before I turn things over to Francisco, I just wanted to mention, for those of you interested in these topics, because we're going to cover inequality, we're going to talk about education, we're going to talk about the political system. There's a conference that we've organized in the Brazil Institute with the Institute for Latin American Studies on populism in Latin America and beyond. So it's quite a wide-ranging conference, because it's cases of populism, not just in Latin America, but in many other countries as well. And that will be on the 18th and 19th of March of this year. And the registration page has just gone live. So if you can sign up to listen to the first day or the second day or both days of that conference, 18th and 19th of March of this year. But without talking more, I'd like to turn things over to Francisco.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and thanks to Danielle for the invitation. It's great to be on this panel with some old friends, some new friends. I remember as a teenager going on all the Direta Já marches, including the gigantic one at Praça da Sé in São Paulo, which took place 36 years ago or a little bit before then, for this moment of transition, which was so important. And I'm delighted that we're having this discussion now at a time when actually a number of those conquests, of those achievements for democracy in Brazil are actually under threat once again. Probably never under as much threat as now for the whole period. Now we have Matias and others who will speak about the political science of this much better than I could. So what I'll do is just stick to my mandate, which is talk a little bit about high inequality in Brazil. But I look forward to the main part of the conversation, which will be on the politics of Brazil then and now. So let me share my screen here, if I may, just to show you some slides very quickly. Can you see the screen? Great, okay. So, I don't have a lot of time, 10 minutes, so let me just be very quick. So the first point I want to make is that despite progress, which I'll talk about in a moment, Brazil remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. In this picture here, you have some data from the World Bank from a time when both Joana and I worked there. These are 101 countries with their Gini coefficients circa 2013. And there's Brazil. So Brazil is, was at that time, it always varies a little bit depending on what countries you've got. But in this picture, it was the 5th most unequal country in the world around 2013. 2 years later, the World Bank produced another report of the same kind. Here, instead of the Gini coefficient, they've got the Palma ratio at the top up here, and the decile shares over here. So this big black bar, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Are you able to see my cursor? Yeah, great. So over here, you've got, the top 10%, and here tinily, almost invisible, the bottom 10%, the next 10%, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on. So here are the most unequal countries with a very large share at the top, a very small share at the bottom. This is the Palma ratio, which is just the ratio of the share of the top 10% to the bottom 40%, and there's Brazil. So in this list, it's it's among the top 3 most unequal countries. As I say, it varies depending a little bit on the sample or what have you. But I want you to bear that in mind as I talk through some of the recent progress that we've had, which I want to talk about in a moment. That Brazil remains by far one of the most unequal countries in the world. Where does that come from? Again, other people in this panel will be better equipped than me to comment on this, but the historical origins really come from the twin original sins of slavery and latifundia, right? The fact that Brazil was initially a country set up with a production system based on huge concentration of wealth, very large plantations, very large concentrations of land given by the Portuguese crown to relatively few people, and where labor was entirely free and dispossessed of any income, any voice, any political power, or any wealth, primarily brought in ships from Africa. Now that's a stylized description, but you've got this mass of dispossessed workers and what capital there was at the time, which is basically land concentrated in very few hands. And the thesis that many Latin American and Brazilian scholars, but also in the West or the North, people like Stan Engerman and Ken Sokolov or Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson have talked about this cycle of unequal wealth generating unequal control over resources, generating unequal power structures, and the power structures reproducing themselves over, from generation to generation in terms of control over resources. And initially it was land, but land eventually became capital, and became industrial capital around the time of the First World War, and then later much more. And it continued to be unequal in terms of our processes of accumulation of human capital through the schooling process. I think perhaps Joana will talk a little bit about the contemporary challenges facing us there. But there is, that large burden of history that one should bear in mind when thinking about this. And this military dictatorship that we're talking about the end of it, right, 36 years ago, was an example, historical example of the rich and powerful preventing a challenge to their hegemonic position, right? Under the previous democratic period, culminating in the government of João Goulart, there were some attempts at reform, there were unions, there was a discussion of land reform, which were perceived as threats by the military regime, by upper classes and their backers in the military, which led to this coup in 1964. So democracy was then restored in 1985, and you would have expected from standard political economy models that if there was democracy and some power was redistributed, we should see lower inequality. And my point here is that it did. We did see this. If you look, this is work by Mark Morgan, who is a recent graduate, recent PhD from the Paris School of Economics. I'll talk about the different series in a moment, but you can see that both of them, all three series rather, are rather stable in this period here from the mid 70s to around 1990, certainly to 85, which was the transition. But then after that, we do see declines, particularly in the bottom two series, which correspond to household survey income and to fiscal income, which combines household survey and tax data. I will ignore the blue line here, which I have issues with. But whether you see these, whenever you see these two lines, either there was substantial decline or more modest decline. And I do say that our knowledge of what happened to Brazilian inequality is subject to measurement caveats and to the inclusion of top incomes in household surveys and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, there was a decline in inequality during democracy. It took a little while. There was a delay. So here, this slide is just on the delay. Between 1985 and 1994, 1995, there was a period of considerable instability in Brazilian inequality, which was primarily associated with an inheritance, a bequest from dictatorship, which was macroeconomic instability and inflation. The graph on the left here from a very old paper of mine with Julie Litchfield just has some correlations. Here's a plot of inequality and inflation in Brazil, which were very highly correlated at this time. So there was, an inheritance of macroeconomic instability and high inflation. Inflation acts as a very regressive tax. It primarily taxes poor people. And so that prevented progress. And it's also a fact that, as Anthony was saying, you have to win the election, you have to win the posse, but you also have to then make laws and you have to govern. And in Brazil, that took some time. And some of the effects on the decline of inequality later on have something to do with the Constitution of 1988 that had to be assembled, it had to be written, and it had to be implemented. I'm not a fan of absolutely everything in the Constitution of 1988. Many people argue it was excessively detailed and sort of reached beyond itself, and there's truth to that. But it also did create mechanisms of redistribution and entitlements to transfers that were not there before, and which we know played a role in the reduction of inequality that followed. So what happened after 1995? So I'll go really quickly here. There was actually progress then. Here I'm showing you in yellow just the Gini coefficient for household per capita income, and in green the Gini coefficient for labor earnings. You see substantial declines. In terms of earnings, there was a decline of 10 points in the Gini. That's a 20% decline right here over this period, which is very considerable decline actually, somewhat less in household per capita income, but it was still there. And it was driven by a number of things. And the main point I'm going to make here is that inequality in Brazil, like elsewhere, is amenable to policy. So one cause I'm going to mention three factors, and we don't have time to go into detail, but three factors that were behind the decline in inequality in Brazil. This is from work with Julián Messina and Sérgio Firpo. One was an earlier expansion in education. This is the cumulative distribution of education. So as it moves to the right, there's more and more educated people, right? So there's big increases in the number of people with more schooling, more, for example, above 10 years of schooling, quite a big increase in that. That causes the returns to education to fall. So as the returns to education to fall, the gaps between the high skilled and the less skilled diminish. That was part of the story. And as we show in this paper, there were also very big declines in the returns to experience. So the gaps between older workers and younger workers, workers with more experience and with less experience, also fell. So in the labor market during this period of 1995 to 2012, there was a narrowing of gaps between the more skilled, the less skilled, the older and the younger, and also between blacks and whites and between men and women and across regions, which I'm not showing you here. This in part reflects this, educational expansion that took place earlier in the 80s and 90s, which had this impact. Another policy that had some impact on inequality at the time was the rise in the minimum wage. Over here, I'm showing you average and median wages, and in light green, you've got the minimum wage in Brazil in this period, which sort of doubled from 1995 to the early 2010s in real terms. And you see the wage distribution here moving, the spike that corresponds to the minimum wage moving to the right considerably. In this paper, we make the point, which I think is interesting, which we don't have time to get into much detail here, but for a period of time in the beginning, actually in the 90s, that actually wasn't equalizing, in part because there was non-compliance with the minimum wages. The minimum wage rose at a time when the labor market wasn't tight. Some firms just made their workers informal and didn't pay them the minimum wage, and so that actually wasn't equalizing. But beyond 2002, when there was the Lula government, but there was also the commodity boom, and there was a very tight labor market and a booming economy, the labor market could support those increases in minimum wage. And in fact, then the minimum wage was quite equalized. So that's the story until around 2012. After that, there's a period of stagnation in the decline of inequality. It kind of stops with the recession of 2015, 2016. There's some evidence that I've kind of shown you earlier here of an increase in inequality a little bit, depending on which series you look, around 2015, 2016. I want to end just to showing some shocking results, at least they were shocking to me, that I found in a recent paper by two IPEA researchers, Mauricio Reis and Joana Costa, that actually show that during the pandemic, when I was expecting inequality to rise, there was actually a decline in inequality in Brazil. On the right, you'll see a number of inequality measures, the Gini coefficient, the Pile index, the Pile L. And then you see them tracking this PNAD COVID-19 household survey, which followed people every month. And you see, a big decline when the renda básica de emergência, the emergency income that was given, 600 reais per person to lots of informal sector workers, and an increase in unemployment insurance and other transfers at that time. You see a very big decline in the Gini then and in all these measures. And interestingly, it continues after that, which you see here, the quintile 1 and 2, the poorest quintiles of the distribution kind of rising a little bit, whilst quintile 5 doesn't recover from its initial shock, the richest people here. There's an argument the authors make that this reflects that the informal sector labor market and occupations occupied by the poor actually recovered a little faster than the others. Now, there's a lot we could discuss. This is a working paper. It hasn't been published yet. There will be issues of attrition in this survey. I'm not staking my life out here on this, but the fact is that Brazil, like some European countries, it turns out, where there were transfers where there was a policy response in terms of cash transfers to the onset of the pandemic, managed at least to neutralize what appeared to have been a very, very unequalizing shock in the first place. And so I want to mention that. My last slide, just, this is an old slide of mine. This is a plot of inequality in income on the x-axis and a measure of inequality of opportunities, which I won't bore you with how that's calculated, but it's a measure of inequality of opportunity. You can think of it as fairly close to intergenerational mobility, or the lack of intergenerational mobility. There's Brazil next to Guatemala, just doing a little bit better than South Africa, but at the very end of this kind of transformed Great Gatsby curve that I've plotted here, a country with still massive levels of inequality, despite these improvements I've just shown you. And those, therefore, affect the chances of younger people in the newer generations, so that their opportunities are also unequally distributed. And that obviously has implications for the kind of country that it is. So to conclude, democracy, the 36 years since 1985, have seen improvements in income distribution, but those improvements still leave much, much to be desired and a lot of work to be done. With that, I'll stop sharing, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Francisco. Sorry, not only for showing us that inequality came down from the period of 85 to 2012, that democracy mattered for Brazil, but also this more surprising result that you're working on, that inequality dropped in the coronavirus crisis. That's actually encouraging. And I think what the transfers were something like 8% of GDP. So there was a strong response, and that's encouraging. Joana, we now like to bring you in to talk about education.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you very much, Danielle, for the invitation. So let me start by sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. Host, can you please enable me to share the screen? So thank you very much. Still not able to share the screen, sorry.
Did they make you a host? They had to make me a host so I could share, and I don't know if I know how to make you a host. I don't know if James is still there and is able to fix that. If not, I can try to figure out how to make you a host.
Sorry. Okay, so it's solved. So are you seeing my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Wonderful. I'm so happy. Thank you very much. So the theme of my presentation was what are the challenges around informality and the quality of education that persist in Brazil? These are very important questions. And the central message of this presentation is really that we can't address all concerns about these two key issues from just a skills perspective. And why? Because good jobs are really important. It's not enough to incentivize formalization, to force it. It's important to focus on good firms, because good jobs are often associated with good firms. And the key challenge will be really how to balance policies from education perspective, a human capital perspective, with policies from a general perspective, regional policies, competition policies, information policies, and I'm going to argue a bit around these lines. And regarding COVID, the question is whether it's an opportunity to beat the informality and low quality of education, and you'll see at the end that my answer is not so encouraging. So what are the challenges around informality in Brazil? Let's turn to some facts. So when we look at Brazil historically, the country has had always high levels of informality. In 2015, the level of formality was about 70%, almost 70%. So 30-some% of the labor force was informal. this sounds like high, but we can always put it in perspective. 80% of the salaried workers in Peru are informal. Informality is also very high in Mexico, Colombia, etc. But still, this is a high number. And we see here the trend. There was a strong improvement in the 2000s, and then there was kind of a stagnation. And you see in the COVID crisis in the last year some increase in informality from recent statistics. Interesting is also to know that 40% of all informal workers work in fact in registry firms. So I think this is particularly important for our reflection on, if we want to improve these outcomes, we need good jobs and good firms. So what are normally the causes of informality and things that have been sought in Brazil? One usual suspect is really that entry costs for the formal sector are high. Another idea is that tax, labor regulations, corruption, and institutional quality are important obstacles. But we saw many countries that, for example, flexibilized contracts change the tax codes, and we didn't see dramatic change. Another less spoken but very important determinant of informality is really external shocks, crises. A key difference between many developing countries, we say OECD countries, is that OECD countries growth is smooth and there are few crises, whether in Brazil and other developing countries there are frequent crises and more severe crises. And what we see often in these negative demand shocks is that firms downsize and many workers transit to informality without coming back to the formal sector. And finally, it has to do to the human capital that exists in the country and this choice that people do in terms of supplying formal and informal labor. So with this setting, what we see is that, the first point to be made is that formal jobs are really different from informal jobs in Brazil. They were in 2002 and they remain in 2015. So here we see in the graph on the left, the penalty of being an informal salaried worker in the first bar versus being a formal worker. And it is about 44%. So on average, informal salaried workers and 44% less than the formal ones. And we see that the difference is smaller for self-employed versus formal, but is also still very significant at 54%. We see that these differences decreased between 2002 and 2015. The bars here are smaller, but they are still pretty high. Another interesting thing about wages of informal workers is that the variance of wages is significantly higher, as shown in this graph on the right, for self-employed. So the self-employed have a very big dispersion of wages, much higher than informal salaried workers or formal salaried workers. And when we think about this is a problem, is not, we have to remember that formal jobs, in addition to the wage premium, they also have other benefits, the coverage by labor regulations, by social security, a higher job security, and often in the literature it has been shown, including also in Brazil, that normally formal jobs have higher on-the-job human capital accumulation, higher training levels. So then the next question is, who switches from the formal to the informal sector in Brazil? And what we see in this table that we did in a paper by Kurin and myself, is that they are more likely to be male, younger, more educated than the stayers. They tend to have observable characteristics that are in fact very similar to those who already work in the formal sector. So the likelihood of switching is from workers similar to those already there. And this is also here in this table, where basically what we see is most of the formalized workers were previously informal salaried workers. They were not out of labor force, they were not unemployed workers, they were not self-employed, they were already informal salaried workers. And when we see their origin in terms of the quintile of wages that they belong to in the origin, we see that they were already in a high quintile of the income distribution, of the wage distribution. So they were already well paid, informal workers that managed to transit. And when they transit, they enter informality at relatively low levels. So 40% of them are below the median informal wage. So these are interesting things for our reflection. And what we saw also in Brazil is that the structure of work has changed through time and continues in fact to change. When we see the wage here, we plot the growth of the different types of wages. what we see is that when we look at what happened in the 2000, the decade of the 2000, we see that the wages that increased the most were the wages of those at the bottom of the wage distribution. But similarly, after 2015, the wages that dropped the most were the wages of those at the bottom of the wage distribution, so the red part here. And what's important to remember is that firms do play a big role in this wage dynamics, because if we're in Brazil, and it's not like an outlier in this, but it's particularly low, this percentage in Brazil, approximately 1% of this business, the large business, generate half of the country's formal employment. So it's very, very important when you look at. And you know, an important thing is that many people think is informality an explanation for the lack of progress in productivity in Brazil. And you know, it's true that informality can cause low productivity because, you know, it affects firms' size, firms' decisions in terms of investment, in terms of technology, in terms of access to capital. It affects individuals' decision in terms of whether or not to invest in education. And through this, it affects productivity. It leads to lower tax revenues, and through that, it affects, it has negative effects on productivity. So there is a relationship, but this is not so trivial, because if we see the evidence on the channels through which formalization benefits firms, what we see is that most of the gains driven by this formalization of firms really come from increasing advertisement, from the use of recipe books, not increasing government contracts, nor use of bank accounts or loans. So really, what the literature has been showing, including in Brazil, is that these benefits of formalization are particularly low for small-scale entrepreneurs. So this forced formalization might not be a solution, even though there might be a link between formality and formalization and productivity. So what has, and like Chico was saying, this is an area that is amenable to policy. And what we see is that really there were some interventions. Here is the effects of a list of interventions around the world, giving information to firms, helping them in registration, making registration easy and free, and even giving benefits to those firms that register. And you see that the effects, the coefficients on the impact of these types of policies on formalization are close to zero in most cases. So really the usual suspects might not work in terms of the policy needs. Lowering the costs of formality is often not an effective policy. And why? Because only a minority of firms are in the informal sector are really a reservoir of potentially productive entrepreneurs. Also, the better enforcement has this problem that there is this idea of that some firms are parasite in the sense that they are productive enough to survive in the formal sector, but choose to remain informal to earn higher profits and have cost advantages. But what the evidence has shown for Brazil is that nearly half of all informal firms wouldn't be productive enough to even survive in the formal sector. So, and when we think about welfare policies, such as Bolsa Família and its expansion, we see that its effects on the individual supply on the decision whether to be formal and informal are relatively small, and would be and the positive effects that it creates in the economy through the demand stimulus that it induces by making individuals richer and therefore buying more things, buying in the supermarket, in the street, etc. It gives a stimulus to the economy that then creates formal jobs. So what are the challenges? So in terms of education, what we see in terms of education, so the second question. So what we see in Brazil is that schooling is the most successful social movement of the previous century. It is really the case that private returns are high, like Chico was saying, they have decreased also in terms of education and experience, but they remain very high. So, you know, a person with tertiary degree in Brazil in 2018 earns 144% more than a person with secondary education versus a 54% in the OECD. So there is this big difference. But, you know, among low-income Brazilians, this schooling is not really still enough, in the sense that 20% of the 50 million Brazilians between 14 and 29 has not completed basic education. School dropouts have a very high cost for Brazil. Recent estimations estimate a cost of 3% of GDP due to lower wages, high health costs, higher likelihood of being involved in crime, and many dropouts. But you know, Brazil has done progress in dropouts. They fell from 13.7% to 7%. And you know, COVID, this initial evidence is that really low-income students are showing lower levels of engagement in online schooling, and many have been without classes for almost a year and do not intend to return. These are concerning statistics. When we look at the map, we see a sharp regional inequality in school internet access, and the poor places are the ones that don't have access. So these, I think, are something to read. And also, schooling isn't learning. So when we look at the conversions of primary school test scores, we see that Brazil is really not well placed in terms of its ranking, in terms of its international position, and also it hasn't converged much in terms of maths in the recent years. So this is the OECD, the blue line is the OECD average, and the black line is Brazil, and we see that there is a big gap between the two that hasn't decreased recently. So then we can wonder what are the constraints for individuals to invest in education, and we always think about lack of information, maybe they don't know how important it is, how high are its returns, maybe it's barriers to accessing these returns, maybe is liquidity constraint, maybe it's preferences. So an important thing that we saw recently in a paper that we did was like, let's look at the pool, let's see that if in their cases enrollment, which is something that we can incentivize with conditional cash transfers, for example, has very important effects on learning. And what we see for Brazil is that this effect doesn't seem to be there so strongly, that we really have to improve the supply, the quality of the teaching to have results. So what did we learn? So we have good evidence that human capital investment does respond to labor market opportunities, to returns to education, and information will be very important, is missing, and is missing more in some places than others. This addressing the credit constraints, this evidence on Bolsa Família shows that we need to worry about quality as well on the supply side. It's not enough to give funds to the person, we need to also worry about the quality of the schools. And teachers do matter. Evidence from Brazil shows clearly that those teachers employed in more than a school negatively impact test scores. And when a student moves from a worse teacher to a high value-added teacher, they do improve. So these are things that we should, think about. So what would be the right policy mix? So on one hand, we have these human capital policies that really, as I argued here, they have to focus on quality and on employability. So this focus not just on providing people, but we really have to have good workers in good firms. So this requires these skills to be valuable and translate into productivity. And we need better firms. So all that has to do with the competition policy, innovation policy, FDI are very important for these jobs to exist, that then lead to investment in education and then to better jobs. And less and better managed crises. Like as they deroot so much the countries and the good jobs and they don't appear again, they change the structure of the economies. This is really something to have in mind. So what about COVID? So COVID is really exacerbating existing trends. And from what we see here is that if anything, these big challenges of informality and low quality of education became more urgent. And without doing it all, we can do some things on this list of things that I said that are important steps in a very important direction for Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Joana. I'm especially curious, given that the emergency auxiliary payments have stopped, what's going to happen to the informal sector workers now? It's a very challenging time. But thank you for a very rich analysis. And I wanted to remind those of you on the listening that you can write questions to any of the speakers, to Francisco, to Joana, and our next speaker, Matias, in the Q&A function. You don't have to wait to the end. You can write your questions as they occur to you, and Danielle will process those. So we haven't yet spoken so much about the dictatorship of 64 to 85, which came to an end, more or less came to an end in 85. And we also haven't spoken much about the presence of military officers, both retired and active duty in the current government in Brazil. And that's a topic that Matias is going to analyze for us. So Matias, it's over to you.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you so much for inviting me for this. It's always a treat to go back to King's. So Daniel asked me to answer two impossible questions. The first one is, has Brazil's democracy evolved since transition in 1985? And what does it mean to have so many military officials occupying key government positions? And as I was listening now to both Joana and Francisco, the striking thing, of course, is that many of you will be asking yourselves, what accounts for such an outrageous level of bad governance in Brazil? And might the quality of Brazilian democracy have anything to do with the country's rather dismal performance on scores like education and inequality? So that's what I'll try to do. And what I thought I'd do is break this up in three different parts. So first, I will try to answer the question as to what's the status of the military in Brazilian democracy before Bolsonaro came to office. Then I will try to say something about the way Bolsonaro has been leveraging his military connections now. And then I will just close up by trying to give you my view of what the Bolsonaro experience thus far tells us about the quality of Brazilian democracy and its resilience moving forward. So let me begin with the issue of the military before Bolsonaro. There is this phenomenal work by Professor Wendy Hunter. She is the authority on the issue of the role of the military in Brazilian democracy. And her thesis is, Brazil transition, and by the mid-1990s, the military were back in the barracks. And indeed they were. Of course, they had a great deal of leeway in the federal budget, a lot of autonomy in determining their corporatist interests. They also managed to secure something that no military in South America managed to secure, which was total amnesty for the crimes committed in the 2 decades of dictatorial rule during the Cold War. So the military, Wendy Hunter shows, were powerful creatures by the mid-1990s, but they were in check. But then we've had now 2 decades since that time. And there are 2 issues that became super salient in Brazilian democratic life that were not expected to be as salient back in the day, that have brought back the issue of the military in a very powerful way. And this is all before Bolsonaro's arrival on the political scene. One, of course, is levels of violence across class, across region, throughout Brazil, and the issue of endemic political corruption involving the political class, the civilian political class. So let me give you a few figures, just the period before Bolsonaro comes to office. So let's take 2017. In 2017, according to The Economist magazine, 17 of the 50 most violent cities in the world were located in Brazil. That year, we had almost 64,000 homicides, which is a murder rate higher than Mexico's. At the time, already one could see that voters, wealthy voters, poorer voters, were being drawn to candidates of law and order. This is not just a phenomenon in Brazil, of course. We see it across Latin America. Voters wanting candidates who can make a credible commitment to fighting crime. And in that context, not only Bolsonaro, who was about to break on the scene, but many other candidates began to speak a language that was reminiscent of the language that the military spoke back in dictatorial days. The notion that you can use force to combat crime, even if you restrict due process, and that's legitimate if it's to fight crime. The argument that the age at which defendants can be charged as adults needs to be lower. The notion that you need to loosen gun laws so people can defend themselves. The notion that the police force, in particular the military police, which respond to state governors, needs to have more autonomy, but also greater firepower, so on and so forth. So that was one of the big baskets. The other was endemic corruption. And I will speak in a moment about corruption and Brazilian democracy. But I think what's important to highlight, and this is something, I mean, if you want to refer to a single piece where the case is made, I would suggest you read the Wendy Hunter and Tim Power piece in the Journal of Democracy on Bolsonaro's illiberal backlash. And the figures are really quite staggering, right? By 2018, so the 1 year Bolsonaro begins to campaign in earnest, we have a situation in which support for democracy and satisfaction with democracy in Brazil is at a historical low, given that Brazil was already very low when compared to other Latin American countries. But basically, if you look at the Latino barometer graphs, it's really quite staggering. If in 2010, 49% of respondents said they were satisfied with the regime, with the democratic regime, 49%. By 2018, that was 9%. So a dramatic drop in support for democracy. And I think it's Tim Power, I can't remember where exactly, but I think it's Tim Power who shows, using Latino barometer data, that around 2015, the number of respondents that claim that democracy is actually not preferable to any other type of government shoots up in a very dramatic way. So in this particular sense, I think it's important to highlight that it seems very clear that Bolsonaro is not so much the cause of democratic decay in Brazil today, as much as he is a symptom of that democratic decay. Let me turn to the issue of Bolsonaro and his relationship with the military. So throughout the late 1980s, the 90s, and the 2000s, Bolsonaro became renowned as a fairly irrelevant member of parliament, but one who built up a reputation as an extremist. Many considered him a buffoon. You know, he had his platform was defending military salaries, improvement in military salaries, and shutting down any talk of a national truth commission to look at the crimes committed under dictatorial rule. But also at the time already, he sort of embodied the very hardline law and order argument, sort of eye for an eye discourse that has become so prevalent, again, across Latin America, but in Brazil in particular. And within that world, Bolsonaro stood up to argue that the problem with human rights and the problem with human rights activists is that they are so willing to embrace values at the expense of public safety. And that cannot, and that will simply not do. So Bolsonaro embarked on this phenomenal rise by adopting this highly successful communication strategy, in many respects a copy of the Trump booklet, you know, provoking opponents, generating controversy. If you want to read to what, in my view, is the best book on Bolsonaro's rise, that's the book by Mauricio Moura on the campaign strategy in 2018. The exact title now escapes me completely. But the point here is that Bolsonaro revived a sort of nostalgia for the military dictatorship that began to gain traction, not only because of the security situation, but because of the revelation of massive corruption scandals we will discuss in a minute. So this is how Bolsonaro begins to try to leverage his reputation as a pro-military dictatorship advocate to try and sound the law and order anti-corruption message. And by the time we get to the 2018 election, this is what the electorate seems to want. So Bolsonaro begins to emphasize his own role as an army officer when he was younger. He begins to defend the military dictatorship quite overtly. Some of you may remember that perhaps the most shocking component of all of these is that on national television during the 2016 impeachment procedures against Dilma Rousseff, he dedicated his vote to the one person who had who oversaw the torture sessions that Dilma Rousseff suffered under dictatorial rule in the 1970s. So, it's no surprise, therefore, that Bolsonaro should have picked a very outspoken general as his VP, and that he would name more military officers to cabinet than any of his predecessors, including the military presidents themselves back from dictatorial days. The argument there was that Bolsonaro would draw on the military for protection, and that is very clearly a break with the last 30 years of Brazilian democracy. If you want to have a sense of the degree to which he has over time come to rely on the military, there's this phenomenal piece by Malu Gaspar in Revista Piauí on the issue of the big decision he tried to make to convince the military commanders to storm the Supreme Court at some point. The reason why he's managed to get away with all of this is, of course, because there's no single leader or party today in opposition that can mount an effective challenge. It's interesting that we're hosting this event today. Some of you may know that yesterday we began the second phase of the Bolsonaro administration, where the president managed to win the speakerships for both the lower chamber and the Senate, prepping the ground for his re-election campaign for the 2022 elections. Both the PT, the Workers' Party, and the Social Democratic Party, the PSDB, are mere shadows of their former selves. So all of these suggest that Bolsonaro's illiberal nature, if you want, and his strategic use of the military have gone unchecked. And the question is, of course, will they remain unchecked moving forward? And with this, I want to move to the third bit of what I wanted to say, and the final one, which is, what is it that we've learned about Brazil's political system? What does the Bolsonaro experience now tells us about that system? And here's the story. The story goes like this. When Brazil transitioned to democracy, some political scientists, chiefly this guy called Juan Lins, warned that the system was frail, that it was bound to fail because it was a minority presidential system in which the head of the executive is elected on a platform that has very little connection to the platform upon which members of Congress run. And the president, who's always in a minority, needs to build up this massive coalition, and it needs to be massive to account for defections and betrayals, and there's no ideological coherence. So the survival in office of the members of parliament has very little relationship with the success of the agenda of the president. But it has a lot to do with pork, with the ability of members of Congress to extract concessions, money, funds from the executive. So that was the warning in the very early 1990s. Then came a generation of scholars, most of them from Brazil, which then became hegemonic in the conversation within political science. The notion is, correctly so, that contrary to what Juan Lins was saying this was going to be unstable. This generation of scholars began to say, wait a minute, this is actually fairly stable. And not only is it fairly stable, it also manages to deliver some goods. So, Brazil could go through the impeachment of Fernando Collor de Mello. It could provide financial stability and end hyperinflation. It could come up with some intelligent social policy. It could produce some degree of redistribution. So it was not terrible. It was actually fairly stable. It didn't go through the bumps that many expected it would go through. So, all in all, it works. But then, of course, came 2014. 2014 is the year in which Brazil undergoes this phenomenal process that goes under the name of Lava Jato, but can be explained, I think, effectively like this. Brazil built up a minority presidential system that did provide stability and did provide some goods. And yet, the stability of that system was premised on the notion that the electorate did not have access to information about how the president forms his majorities. We thought the president formed majorities by dispensing pork, by splitting his cabinet among the members of his coalition, and that sufficed to provide the stability the country needed. But what we learned through Lava Jato is that actually the president builds coalitions by deploying all these tools, but deploying additional tools which are illegal, namely collusion between the executive and private conglomerates to generate finance that gets illegally siphoned to members of parliament to pay for the political campaigns. And what's so fascinating about it is that the system is so prevalent, it's so extensive, and it's so dramatic, it's so endemic to the way Brazilian democracy works, that actually the president becomes funder-in-chief, illegal funder-in-chief, not only for parties in the governing coalition, but even for parliament, for parties in opposition. And by the time we get to realize what the mechanisms are, we begin to understand some of the things Francisco was showing us. How do you account for a country which 30 years ago manages to extract around 20% of taxation from society, which across 3 consecutive decades moves from sort of 20% taxation to 40% taxation? A state apparatus which is relatively strong, that it's massive by most comparisons in the developing world, and yet produces bad governance year in, year out. Even if Brazil begins to spend gazillions of dollars in education, when you look at Brazil's performance in the PISA exam, it's a pathetic, very depressing, sort of flattish line. The same going for many other areas of social policy. So now we begin to understand the relationship between endemic corruption on the one hand and the inability that Brazilian democracy has had to provide good governance. The periods in which, and Francisco is the expert, so he will correct me, but from this perspective, the periods in which Brazil's political system manages to actually deliver good things to the Brazilian electorate are periods in which the global political economy is going well. And in particular, when international interest rates are low and commodity prices are high. This is the latest work by Daniela Campello and Cesar Zucco, 2 of my colleagues here at FGV, who show the relationship between these 2 factors, international interest rates and commodity prices, on electoral success in Brazil. But when international winds blow against Brazil, what we have is enormous social decay, and with it, of course, democratic decay. So all of this is to say, to reinforce the point, Bolsonaro is not the cause of Brazil's democratic decay, it's its symptom. And part of the problem, in my view, is that the rules of the political game that we have are such that it's very hard to provide good governance. The incentives are not for the provision of good governance. And the election of the candidates of Bolsonaro to the speakership of the House and of the Senate yesterday are just yet another example of how bad governance prevails in our political system. So it is no wonder that the electorate are not convinced about the wonders of democracy. Unless we change the political rules of the game, the conclusion would be, you know, those who worry about the quality of democracy and the resilience of Brazilian democracy in the future will be in very serious trouble. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Matias, for that sobering analysis. I wanted to thank Masuko André and Rosemary Barbosa da Silva for reminding us that the book that you referred to, Matias, by Mauricio Moura and Giuliano Corbellini is called Eleição Disruptiva, Por que Bolsonaro Venceu. So the disruptive election, why Bolsonaro won. A lot to chew on. And Nicola, I don't know how much exposure you've had to all things Brazilian, but I know that you're a specialist in international politics and domestic comparative politics. I'm sure there are things that resonate for you with these three presentations. So I wanted to turn things over to you for some comments.
Thank you very much. I can't decide whether I'm feeling really privileged to have the role of commentator for 5 minutes on these presentations, or slightly anguished because all of those presentations offered such rich perspective and such provocative perspective on some of the really critical issues that all of us here and everybody who's on the call as well will be interested in. I'm also distracted by the really good questions and comments that are already coming through on the chat here. I'm going to, what I had decided to do before the session started, to try to draw out some common themes across the presentations rather than go presentation by presentation, and just throw in a few questions which might provoke some useful discussion. But I'm going to try to be really brief because I think it's really important that that everybody who's made the effort to attend this evening has the opportunity to pose questions as well to our speakers. Anthony, you're quite right. I wouldn't describe myself as a Brazil specialist, although I have worked quite extensively on that country. But I am a professor of global political economy, and so I think my first question goes straight to what I think in all of the richness of the conversation I miss slightly, and I think there's an invitation to the panelists to reflect on the global context that is shaping some of the political and social and political dynamics that have been outlined. I think what I want to do, I mean, Matias, you mentioned some of these influences right at the end of your presentation, and that was really welcome. But I think what I would like to do is just pose that as an open-ended question, which we could think about. I was thinking about in a number of different ways through the presentations. First, and this reflects my own interest in the global economic processes or political economic processes that are shaping both some of the dynamics that you have all described, but also the outcomes, particularly in relation to inequality and informality. Particularly interested in the extent to which colleagues think that the way that the global economy works, the power of big business, the way that trade and production are organized, contribute to the kinds of processes and trends that you so meticulously and carefully outlined. Particularly interested perhaps in the relationship that many scholars have commented on, and Brazil has often been used as an example of this, of the relationship between globalization in all of its forms and inequality. So I'll just pose that as an open-ended question. There's also, of course, the political context, and I think we got Matias close to that in your comments about how some of the political trends in Brazil reflect some political trends much more broadly across the world. There was some mention of the major institutions of global governance and the extent to which they may or may not have a role in dealing with some of the challenges, the threats, both social and political, that we've outlined. So I think the first question is about how the global context comes into play in this picture. The second, and I'm going to have to choose very, very carefully here, but I think what I really welcomed about both Francisco and Joana's presentations was that The problems of inequality and informality and their links to education were presented very clearly as political issues. Francisco, I think you used the expression that they are amenable to policy, and that where we see good policy emerging, we do see positive impacts. We do see, in your language, Matias, good things being delivered through the processes of governance. And I was thinking then, as we move through the conversation, about the question that you posed, Matias, about whether the quality of democracy is related in some way, and if so, how, to the disappointing outcomes that we have seen in relation to inequality, informality, education, employment, and so on. And of course, the immediate point of comparison that comes to mind here, whenever one talks about democracy or the nature of the political system, is China. And that is always the point of comparison that leads us to at least question some of the assumptions that the better the quality of democracy, the better the quality of governance and policy making, and therefore the better the outcomes in terms of poverty, inequality, growth, development, and so on. And so I think linking all of the presentations together into that question about whether the quality of democracy can be thought to be responsible for some of the policy failures that we've seen and some of the disappointing outcomes is important. And I think, again, that global comparative perspective could help us there. And then I think probably spectacularly unhelpfully for the panel, because it's such a huge question, I personally would really welcome thoughts on the future. Post-pandemic future, but broadly, what all of these trends add up to in terms of your assessment of the future directions that Brazil is likely to take, and the political and social processes that underpin it. We received a very bleak picture of the current state of democracy, a weakening of the major political parties that formerly had been a mainstay of the system, unchecked military power, all of the questions about governance and policy making that were mentioned. Slightly more positive on inequality, in as much as the picture is held up during the pandemic, at least so far, but nevertheless clearly inequality that is running still at very, very high levels, and perhaps it's unclear, certainly it is to me, where the political leadership is going to come from in order to improve on that situation, and the ongoing problems with employment, informality, the challenge that you raised, Joana, of needing good firms in order to improve the quality of jobs that are being created, and improve the relationship that exists between between education and employment and informality. So unhelpfully, they're probably excessively broad questions for the panel to consider, but they represent some of the thoughts that the presentation stimulated in my mind, to go along, I hope, with some really interesting questions as well from everybody who's joined the call. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Those are really great, provocative, challenging questions. And I'm going to be unhelpful as well by trying to squeeze the panelists and saying you're not going to have very much time to address any of these things. So I'm going to be very strict and only give you guys about 6 or 7 minutes to tackle the questions that Nicola's raised, but also some from our audience. So if we can go in the order that the presentations went, Francisco, in addition to what Nicola's raised, we have a question from Patrick Towell about what could facilitate entrepreneurship and sort of moving from the informal to the formal sector. We have another question from Liliana Bermudez, and she asks, to what extent is Brazil effective in reducing inequality after taxes and transfers? So specifically, how taxes and transfers alter the pre-existing inequality. And we have a question from Ryan Naring, specifically for you, Francisco, on, he's saying that you mentioned the colonial and imperial history and the historical causes of inequality, including land inequality. And to what extent does that change? How much do you move away from that when you look at more recent gains due to educational attainment, increases in the minimum wage? And then he kind of says provocatively, if you don't dismantle the rural oligarchy, are you stuck then with without the political capacity to attack structural inequality? So those, I think that's plenty for you to chew on, Francisco. I could throw some more questions at you, but I'll leave those for the other panelists, but take it away.
Thanks very much. Now, when you said 6 or 7 minutes, I assume that was for all of us, right?
No, Francisco, each. You can take,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. All right.
Half hour.
Okay, well, even so, excellent questions, of course, from Nicola and from the panelists, from the audience. So let me start with the ones from the audience, which are in some, well, at least some of them are slightly narrower, and I'll leave the one on formality and informality to Joana, who's better qualified than me to answer it. On the extent of redistribution after taxes and transfers, the answer, I don't have the numbers on me right now, but the answer, broadly speaking, is not very much, despite the fact, as Matias highlighted, despite the fact that Brazil's state is actually a large state at 40% as tax effort of GDP. We're unusually large state in the developing world, right? Almost at the lower end of OECD level. But if you compare, as Nora Lustig has done, the extent to which the Brazilian fiscal system, taxation and expenditure redistribute, it's much less than most OECD countries. The exceptions being the ones you'd expect, Colombia and Mexico, which are also Latin American. Chile redistributes quite a bit more than we do, although not an enormous amount either. This goes to the point, Matias touched on this a bit, and there's a big literature also amongst economists, work by Ricardo Paes de Barros and José Márcio Camargo and various others, on the fact that our state is kind of deeply dysfunctional, and it's often not a question of there being need for more government intervention, but just better government intervention, and that we often spend in things that don't help either efficiency or equity. We subsidize pensions of very large pensions to high-earning public servants. We typically spent a lot on tertiary education for people who could afford to pay for it, and not enough on pre-primary and primary education for people who cannot afford to pay for it. These are old issues. I've been reading about them and then writing about them since I was in my 20s, and unfortunately they remain relevant, which is very sad, but true. So that's on that. On the question on kind of the rural oligarchy, I'm not an economic historian, and I don't want to, and I felt it was important to make the point that these have deep historical roots. And I don't want to claim that I'm an expert on something that I'm not, but what I would say is that rich people are very good at transmitting their resources down into future generations, and in repositioning themselves in the occupations and sectors that have promise. I remember some work on how the coffee growers of the state of São Paulo were basically the same people who began industrialization in São Paulo very early, just around the First World War, before the big expansion of manufacturing in Brazil, around the Second World War. And so, money moves and these resources move. And so I think the Brazilian elite has been able to continue to capture a lot of influence, as our capitalism moved from rural to manufacturing to financial and so on. Obviously, there's been changes. Obviously, there's some mobility in and out of that, but that inequality has persisted. And our education system is very, very deeply unequal. Again, Joana can comment on that much more. But the differences between what you see in public schooling and private schools in Brazil is just dramatic, and as you all probably know. So let me leave it there and then try to take Nicola's questions a little bit. I mean, again, Nicola, just, you know, these are excellent and very deep questions. So I won't do justice to them, but a few reflections on some of them. You raised first the issue of the global context and globalization and inequality. Two thoughts of that. On Matias's excellent presentation, obviously the fact that Bolsonaro is not alone, right? And I think I saw something in the chat about Orban and Erdogan, and we had Trump and, you know, and Duterte in the Philippines, and any range of Poland. So there's something there which is for a political scientist to comment on and not me, but this presumably has helped. I mean, the fact that your president is not seen unanimously and overwhelmingly as a lunatic by the outside world, because there are other lunatics like him, so he doesn't look like a lunatic, is you know, matters. But I'll leave that to other, maybe Matias can comment on it. So that's one aspect of global context. You were also asking about globalization and inequality. There, I mean, that is a literature I have some familiarity with. It's complex, and at the risk of simplifying, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, the effect of globalization, broadly understood, on global inequality has been to reduce it. And we know this from Branko Milanovic and lots of other people, Saleh Martin, lots of people, largely because China and India grew dramatically and therefore reduced, you know, they were very poor and helped reduce inequality. For a period there, a little bit of Africa as well, but only during a commodity boom, as Matias again highlighted. Right now, we're at a time, I was reading a very new paper by Angus Deaton that shows that actually China has now just moved past the sort of mean of per capita incomes in the world, and therefore further growth in China is actually disequalizing. So what we'll see in the future will change as a result of that. In terms of domestic inequality, globalization is primarily unequalizing in richer countries, like the US and to some extent European countries, and we've seen that. In poorer countries, you know, but the Stoper-Samuelson theorem and the sort of trade theory would predict that it should be equalizing. There was a lot of literature early on countries where this was not the case. For example, Mexico and Colombia, where there's quite a bit of evidence from people saying, well, actually it was unequalizing even there. But Brazil was not like that. So the work that has been done on trade and inequality in Brazil, I had a paper, but there's some much nicer work by Brian Kovac and the Brazilian guy, God, I'm blanking on his name now.
Rafael de Carneiro.
Obrigado. Rafael de Carneiro. Their work, you know, also shows that actually exposure to trade and openness to trade between the late 80s and the 90s was actually equalizing in a Brazilian context. You know, we can debate that further, but let me leave it there. Then there was a question on quality of democracy. You had a question on quality of democracy and bad outcomes. You know, again, Joana and Matias would be better qualified than me to speak on that. Let me just say one thing, which is when I was hearing Matias's very interesting discussion on the stable equilibrium of Brazilian democracy, it occurred to me, you know, many of us model things in terms of multiple equilibria, right? Systems with multiple equilibria. This was a stable low-level equilibrium, right? It's a stable bad equilibrium. And in that sense, it's actually bad that it's stable because you're sort of trapped. Now, you know, it could be very complicated. It could be three equilibria, one of which is dictatorship, or, you know, a sort of authoritarian, illiberal populism a la Orban tropical, which is, you know, maybe what Bolsonaro is trying to set up. In which case, you know, maybe the bad equilibrium we're in now is not so bad, but clearly there ought to be a better equilibrium out there where we use the 40% of taxes that we raise to actually deliver the public services that can move the country forward, not only in terms of inequality, but in terms of productivity, which, you know, is something that Joana emphasized, and which is a very big challenge. I mean, let's not forget that if you look, you know, none of us had graphs on this, but if you plotted Brazil's median level of living, you know, median standards of living, mean income, or whatever you wanted to compare, with other countries over the last 30 years, we've been lagging behind. massively. This is a point that Marcos Lisboa likes to make all the time. So, there's inequality and all that, but the fact is our levels of living, which matter for poverty, for example, we're doing very, very badly in terms of growth, according to all comparators. I mean, China, of course, East Asia, South Asia, but even in Latin America, we're being overtaken by lots of countries. Okay. Thoughts on the future, lastly, and that's it, 30 seconds on that. I always used to be an optimist about Brazil. And, there was a time, the time when the PSDB and the PT were the former selves, of which they are now shadows, as Matias mentioned. When I was very optimistic, we had come out of the dictatorship, and there was almost a consensus in Brazil that inequality had to be fought, that you needed to spend in education and infrastructure. There was very little craziness at the extremes, or the craziness at the extremes was hidden. You didn't have this fascists had gone away, and nobody was talking about communists either. And now all of a sudden we're back in this kind of highly polarized world where nobody is making the sort of arguments in the center, and the PT is sort of a slave to its former leaders in a way that is really unhelpful to it, in my view. So I'm not terribly optimistic, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Francisco. What you said about Brazil's relative performance reminds me of a new book by Matthew Taylor called Decadent Developmentalism. And one of his main points in that book is that Brazil doesn't compare favorably to other middle-income countries over the last few decades. Its performance just hasn't been that good on a number of dimensions. But Joana, I'll have to hold you to the same rigorous standard here, 6 or 7 minutes. In addition to Nicola's provocative questions, Roberto Santos said, how does the quality of education in Brazil compare to that of other countries in Latin America? And then Patrick Towell, you mentioned in your slides that there's some firms for which it doesn't make any sense to try to go into the formal sector because they're not productive enough. But for those that are, what are the chief barriers to moving from informality to formality?
Thank you very much. This is such a set of interesting questions that is hard to choose from. So maybe I start with the global context. So just to complement on Chico's point, so we have recent evidence that globalization might lead to informality, in the sense that to the extent that globalization favors some sectors and it favors others, and relocation has to happen, this process sometimes results in relocation to the informal sector. And the extent to which then the workers can, it's not necessarily that some workers will lose the job who will get the other job. So the mobility, the ability to transit between jobs depends across workers depending on their characteristics. And to this extent, some do move to informality and remain there, because like you saw the statistics that I show you, that the ones that are informal and become formal, they are the ones that are pretty similar to those already formal. So really at the top of the wage distribution. So this is kind of a first important point. Rafael Carneiro in Apartment, they have a lot of work on this, and this is a kind of an important point linked to this global context of an increasingly integrated world, and where globalization is certainly something that is a very dynamic force and very important for firms and workers everywhere, and for Brazil too. The second question, and that links, I think, with Patrick's questions on, the policies. How can we turn this around? How can we incentivize or reduce informality, because it's a variable amenable to policy? So here, the argument that I was making was that, yes, so there are kind of 3 main types of policies that have been put in place, including in Brazil. One has to do with reducing the costs of formality, so eliminating the costs of registration, eliminating the bureaucracy that someone else mentioned, on making it easier to become formal. But those, from that table that I show with the international results, don't seem to increase a lot the level of formalization. Brazil has also tried through a more social program to micro firms to really incentivize their formality. And what happened was that they did become formal, but once the benefits stopped 1 year later, either they closed or they went informal. So here this policy being just either reducing the costs or increasing the benefits in terms of taxes or registration doesn't seem to work so well. And better enforcement does help. It's not that it doesn't help at all. But as I was saying, especially this is particularly important for these firms that are just informal because they want to save in costs and they want to be more profitable, but they have all conditions to be formal. So these are the ones that the enforcement by bringing them into the formality would create employment and more productivity. But what we saw is that many are below the line. So those that are above the line. So what can we do for those firms? There, I think, is really more about growth, about facilitating growth. These policies that I was saying that go beyond the labor market or beyond formality itself. All the things that promote growth will promote the firm's dynamics and the employment creation, being them, reducing distortions that make markets not competitive and that squeeze good firms because they cannot prosper. These can be, disseminating information that is very important. And as someone was saying, at schools, making the entrepreneurship more appealing, train the people to be more entrepreneurial. These are things that are, important and sometimes are a bit out of scope of the direct three lines of action: decrease the cost of formality, increase enforcement, and these other ones that there might be some distortions in the way that welfare systems are designed that are creating informality. So outside of these three, really what I would say is that this emphasis on good firms and what makes good firms that has to do with competition policy, with innovation policy, with FDI. This statistic is really striking that 1% of the firms have 50% of the formal jobs. So, each big firm matters a lot for the level of formality. So in this sense, I think that's some ideas on this. Then, on China, it's again this idea of globalization. So there is a paper that is showing that, in the case of China, there were regions that were winners, regions that were losers. The ones that were exporting commodities were winners. The ones that were competing directly with China in the manufacturing sector were losers. And then again, this relocation process might have affected informality as well as wage gaps. And this again depends a lot on workers' characteristics, so it does affect a lot who becomes informal and the wage gaps. So in this sense, these outcomes are certainly affected by the China shock, and that's very important to understand that there's a lot to be gained, there's a lot to be lost, but there is an important reflection to make. Now, in this COVID time, what is happening? I think, on the one hand, there is this trend towards digitization, and not all jobs are being destroyed. So there are jobs being created, but certainly the jobs being created are more complementary to skilled workers. So in this sense, the low quality of the education sector, the education being provided, is really a problem. The type of education, like you say, that doesn't promote entrepreneurship or doesn't promote technological skills is a problem. And is a problem broader because many countries are in this situation. So either you embark or you'll be lagging behind. Because it's a common shock across countries at the same time and of a very large magnitude. So this is why I say that it's really urgent to act and to understand that we need to do better. And the second part of the shock of the COVID is really a demand shock. So with the slowing trade, the exports decreased everywhere. And, if firms don't sell to the exporting markets and also to the domestic market, where people are in lockdown or not in the consumption spirit, if firms are not in the hiring mode, of course. So in this sense, what we have been studying the crisis, and what we have been seeing is that it's really a moment where the structure of employment really changes, and the level of formality, the formal sector really it's really altered, shrinks at the time of the crisis, and doesn't regain until many years after the level that it had before. So we had like some graphs that show the myth of employment recovery after crisis, and in some crises it's really a myth. It never came back to the previous trend, and it stayed in the lower one. Do I have still 1 minute, or?
Joanna, could you just wrap up, because we're
Yes.
a bit over time and I've got to turn things over to Matias.
Definitely. So on education, how low? Low, very low. There are 4 levels, and Brazil is in the lowest level. It's the lowest is 350. Brazil, it has 356. Didn't improve much. You saw in my graph. Who is worse? Colombia and 2 other countries. So it's really pretty bad in terms of the outcome, the scores. So maybe less so in terms of other indicators, but really, you know, what evaluations are showing is that scores are important, and interventions such as giving information to people on the returns are really things that are transformational, and don't forget the teachers.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm now going to, I think, try your patience a little bit. We've come formally to the end of our time period, but I want to just go a few more minutes, because I think Matias generated quite a few questions, and in addition to what he heard from Nicola, I just wanted to throw a few at you, Matias, and just give you a sense of the audience's reaction to some of the things you mentioned. So G. Leslie asked, why didn't Brazilian democratic presidents change the rules of the game? Why didn't they read Juan Lin's and say, hey, we need a parliamentary system, or make other political changes? Emlyn Humphreys asked, to what extent did the military's participation in transition to democracy facilitate the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff? There was a question from 2 people actually on a similar theme, Mario Suarez Neto and Renato Rodriguez. Is the rise of national populism in Brazil, does that have anything to do with racism, including institutional racism of the police in terms of their lethality and the way they operate? Could there, and this is a common theme of several questions, could there be an institutional rupture? Something like what Orban has done, something like what Erdogan has done, or something different? And Simonas Gisaistas asked if there is a rupture, is that coming from the military as a whole, or is it coming from Bolsonaro and a few lone wolf generals? So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the concerns of our audience. And I know this is a difficult situation because we don't have much time left, Matias, but there you are.
Thank you so much. I'll be super brief. So on the issue of institutional rupture, a lot of the people in the questions I saw were comparing, the analogies were Hungary and Turkey. I don't think that would be the case for Brazil. I don't think the military are in with Bolsonaro because they have any plans to return to power. Their experience of power was fairly disastrous. And when they left, it took them a generation to restore their reputation, because they left a trail of economic destruction behind them and of social destruction behind them as well. Although, of course, the official memory under the military is that law and order were prevailing and that Brazil was a stable country as it modernized and became an urban society. My concern is not that we're going to end up like Turkey or like Hungary. My concern is that we end up like the Philippines. In other words, that we have an elected politician who's found that he has a very popular mandate to crack down on crime. Levels of crime are incredibly high. And in the process, not only he unleashes levels of violence that are truly despicable, but also begins to erode democratic norms in ways that are not a clear-cut rupture with democratic rule. That's my chief concern. I think Duterte worries me more than Erdogan when I think about Bolsonaro's second term, right? The other issue I wanted to tackle is the issue of the future, which is something some of the questions bring and that Nicola brought out. And I think, and with this I will finish because we're over time. Bolsonaro was elected on rage, on anger at a political class that failed to deliver the goods. and on revelations of endemic corruption eroding the quality of democracy in the land. The way I see the future is, the problem is, I think, that Bolsonaro is incapable of providing a good response to that demand. The people were willing to let the old political system collapse. The old parties of the past shrunk and broke, and suddenly we had the rise of the extremists. Things that were inconceivable in Brazilian political life only 2 years ago now are the subject of our every day. Will Bolsonaro manage to quell that thirst? I don't think that's going to be the case. It's very clear that it's not going to be the case. If anything, Bolsonaro has shown that he will remain conducting politics, business as usual. So the question is, how long until Brazil breaks yet again? And the issue, I think, the one big factor we need to look at in the next couple of years is the shape of the global economy. If it is true that there is a new commodity super cycle in the making, then Bolsonaro will be safe. He just managed to elect his preferred candidate for the Senate and for the lower chamber. He's well prepared to face re-election. There's no significant leader in the opposition at all. And if the wind blows in Brazil's favor on the commodity front, for all the Brazilian bad management, bad governance, for all of the problems that afflict the Brazilian economy, you know how people who work in financial markets, they know it. When the wind blows hard, even chickens can fly, right? So Bolsonaro might actually, get away with it and even get reelected. Does this resolve the problem? Of course not. And will this be a problem for the resilience of democracy? Well, if the political system continues to be incapable of providing good governance on the basics, then what can we expect other than people who are really enraged at the quality of the services the political class provides?
Thank you, Matias. That's a very interesting place for our debate to come to rest. I really appreciate all of the rich presentations and the thoughtful comments of Joana, of Nicola, of Francisco, of Matias. I personally have all these questions in my head that I want to keep going on and on and on, but I know we can't exhaust neither our panelists nor our audience. So we have to leave it here. But I would remind you, for those of you who are interested, there will be a conference on populism, 18th, 19th of March at King's. For all that's been said here about the quality of Brazilian education, we got some excellent proposals from Brazilian academics. So higher education, there are pockets of really excellent work going on, not just on Brazilian populism, by the way, but on the Philippines, on India, on Turkey, on all kinds of other cases, including the United States. So I'm looking forward to that. And I want to thank the panelists once again and thank Danielle for putting this together.